This is Bloomberg on the Weekend. I'm Charlie Pellett. Coming up this hour, Citigroup agrees to pay $7 billion in fines and consumer relief to settle a mortgage bond investigation. But first, we kick off the hour with a look at the life of Henry Bergh. And with more, here's Joe Franklin.
Charlie, our guest is Gary Kaskel, 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 whose diverse career has included stand-up comedy, journalism, technology consulting. He's been an actor, a screenwriter, documentary filmmaker, associate producer for Milton Berle Productions. He's an animal rights activist and now author of an exciting new book called Monsters and Miracles, Henry Bergh's America, all about the heroic founder of two great social justice movements in America, animal protection and children's protection. Gary, how you been?
I'm great, Joe. How are you?
Good luck with the book. It's a nice cut. How are animals treated? How are children treated in old New York and Europe in the mid-19th century, Gary? A little bit on that.
Well, it was pretty grim. I mean, animals were principally work animals or food animals in those days. They didn't have a concept of pets like we do today, being members of the family.
Right.
So they were exploited and abused, and in the heat of summer and the dead of winter, horses were dropping dead in the streets of New York. It was quite a grim scene.
Well, who is Henry Bergh? What inspired his heroic quest?
Well, Henry Bergh was a wealthy New Yorker who really was somewhat of a failed playwright and poet for his youth, and was somewhat of a dilettante through his 30s and 40s. He inherited a lot of money and traveled the world, but he, through a friendship with William Seward, who was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, he was appointed the ambassador to St. Petersburg in Russia and spent a couple of years there. And on his way back to America, he stopped in Spain as the guests of the king and queen at a bullfight. And he'd never been to something like this before, and this bloody spectacle really turned his stomach, and he just went crazy. And he just found out that in England there had been a animal protection society since the 1820s. So he decides to stop and visit them, and he does that on the way home and decides to import this model to America. And so he comes back to New York and gets a charter for the first animal protection society in New York State.
So what you just mentioned, that was his connection to Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yes.
So you call Henry Bergh, you call him the most famous American you've never heard of. So why is this great?
That's what's odd.
Why is this great man slipped under history's radar, so to speak?
Well, it's a good question, Joe. That's why I wrote the book, so that people would have an insight into this interesting guy who did two amazing things. After founding the first Animal Protection Society, several years later, he started the first Children's Protection Society after becoming the first plaintiff in a lawsuit to protect the rights of children against parental abuse.
This recognition is long overdue. So, Gary, why is it your mission to make this hero known to every American? What brought this up in your mind?
Well, I'd known about Henry Bergh for many years. I've been involved in animal protection as an executive at two charities, and he's just a lost American hero, and I think he should be taught. His story should be taught in every high school in America.
I agree, and it's a great book. How did Henry Bergh? How did he come into conflict with P.T. Barnum?
Well, P.T. Barnum had an animal museum in Lower Manhattan, and it was made out of wood, and it burned down a couple times. And then he got a letter of complaint that they were feeding the snakes with live bunny rabbits, for the amusement of the patrons, and that started this feud.
You won so many hats. What was the best part of being a producer for Milton Berle Productions? Any recall?
Milton was a wonderful character because he had a memory like a trap. He'd been in the business for his whole life. He knew everybody. And he was just highly entertaining. He always had a story. He always had a joke. He was just a wonderful
So what's Milton Berle's legacy? How did he change the media world?
Well, he changed the world of television, of course, because television was an infant industry after the Second World War. And his show, there was an old joke that, his show sold more televisions than anybody else. My brother sold mine.
No, but I remember the Tuesday night was known as Berle's Day. Between Monday and Wednesday, the whole world would watch Milton Berle on Tuesday nights, right?
Oh yeah, he really made television a popular medium.
That's right. What about Milton Berle in his final
days? To work for.
In his last days at age 93, was he still sharp at 93?
Sharp as a tack. Yeah, I saw him just a few months before he passed, and he was still mentally all there, joking, and he knew he was dying, but he took it all in the spirit of he just had a great joie de vivre. It was really a joy to know.
I loved Uncle Milton. He was on my show so many times. He would take over, and I'd go in the corner and be quiet. He was so great.
Yeah, a great storyteller.
So the new book is
But
called.
he was,
Yeah.
he was an influence, but he was actually a distant relative of mine. He was my grandmother's cousin.
Mm.
And
Monsters and Miracles. Give us, as we wind down, give me another portrait, some atmosphere from old New York and Europe in the mid-19th century. What was it like in general? Not that you were there, but what was happening?
Well, animals roamed the streets. I mean, there were
Right,
farm
right.
animals, there were work animals. The horse was the principal animal that was most visible in the city. But, there were stockyards along the East River. There were stockyards along the Hudson. And, these animals would be transported under terrible conditions. And Henry Bergh finally came in and demanded that the Board of Health create some standards for this. And poisoned milk, by the way, called swill milk, was a big problem in those days, too, because children died from drinking milk that was unclean because they used to feed the cattle unboiled swill, and it would have bacteria in it.
That's right.
It would be transmitted to the children. And Bergh really worked with the first Board of Health in New York to stop that practice.
Gary Kaskel speaking with Joe Franklin. Coming up next, the work of the FDNY Foundation. We've got board member Bob Zito next. This is Bloomberg on the Weekend.